Welcome, dear listeners, to Whispers in the Dark, where shadows tell stories and the night breathes secrets. I'm your guide through the unknown, your storyteller in the silence, weaving tales that will haunt your thoughts long after the last word fades. Here, we embrace the eerie, the unsettling, the stories that lurk just beyond the edge of the firelight. So settle in, dim the lights, and listen closely. The darkness has something to say. So let's begin this haunting tale. The Wheeping Nun. Reverend Elijah Cross arrived in the village of Gloamhollow, under a sky the color of lead. The moors stretched on like an endless bruise, wet with mist and misery. The road to St. Sebastian's parish was thin and winding, flanked by gnarled trees that seemed to lean inward as if whispering secrets to one another. The driver who dropped him off, a quiet, stubbled man who spoke in clipped monosyllables, gave Elijah one last uneasy glance before speeding off, tires kicking up mud. He came alone, his belongings limited to a suitcase of books, a Bible, and the cross he had inherited from his father. His appointment had come suddenly after the disappearance of Father Alaric, a vicar who had served the village for over a decade. No body had been found, just his cassock, folded neatly on the altar. St. Sebastian stood at the edge of the village, half swallowed by creeping ivy. Its slate roof was chipped and worn, and its bell tower leaned slightly westward, like an old man stooping with regret. A mossy graveyard encircled it like a grim halo. Elijah paused before pushing open the heavy wooden doors, which groaned like a dying man's breath. Inside, the church was cold and silent. Rows of pews were blanketed in dust, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew, old wood, and something coppery that clung stubbornly to the nostrils. Candle stubs lay in pools of hardened wax, and the stained glass windows wept rainwater through invisible cracks. Cobwebs quivered in unseen drafts. He lit a taper from his satchel and carried it slowly down the center aisle. Shadows recoiled from the flame. The silence was so complete it had weight. Every footstep was an intrusion. The altar was modest, stone and unadorned. Behind it rose a large crucifix, Christ's face nearly worn smooth by time. Elijah knelt before it and said a quiet prayer, but the silence that followed felt less like reverence and more like anticipation, as if the church itself were holding its breath. He spent the afternoon cleaning, scrubbing mildew from the font and dust from the altar linens. His movements stirred old motes of light that danced in the air like tiny ghosts. He found old hymnals, their pages curled and ink faded. Some bore scrawled notes in the margins, prayers, pleas, and in one case what appeared to be Latin verses scratched so deeply into the paper they had torn through. In the vestry, Elijah discovered a collection of letters tucked in a drawer. Most were mundane, parish matters and Christmas wishes, but one caught his eye. It was unsigned, its ink smeared, with only 2 legible lines. She weeps still. God help us all. Outside, the sky remained a low blanket of gray. Rain came in spurts, as if the heavens were wringing their hands. Villagers occasionally passed the gates, but none stopped to speak. Those he greeted barely nodded. There was a heaviness in the air beyond the moisture, a fear that seemed stitched into the very mist. An old woman with cloudy eyes watched him from a window above the bakery. A child tugged at her sleeve, and she drew the curtain shut without a word. By evening, a sense of wrongness had settled on him. He could not name it, only feel it, like an itch beneath the skin. The hours passed in a gray blur, until night crept in and cast long shadows across the pews. Elijah stood alone in the nave, staring up at the stained glass saints who seemed to watch him with grave solemnity. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, and he thought he saw movement behind the altar, just a flicker. But when he approached, there was nothing. That first night in the rectory was restless. The building was old, with slanted floors and creaking beams that shifted with the cold. The wallpaper peeled like old scabs, revealing layers of forgotten decor, faded floral patterns beneath sallow beige. Mice skittered in the walls. The fireplace emitted more smoke than warmth. When Elijah opened the flue, something clattered out, a rosary, blackened and rusted. He stared at it for a long time before placing it on the mantel. He lay in the small bed beneath a threadbare blanket, staring at the cracked ceiling. Wind clawed at the shutters. Once or twice he heard faint knocking sounds, perhaps the wood settling, perhaps something else. A vague unease coiled in his stomach. Around midnight, he woke with a start. The air was frigid, his breath blooming like fog in the dark. Somewhere in the church, a sound. Crying, faint, distant. A woman's sobs, barely audible but distinct. Elijah sat up, heart thudding. He reached for his candle and robe, then padded down the stone steps that led to the sanctuary. The sound was clearer in the nave. It echoed off stone in a way that made direction impossible. The cry came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It had a cadence, a mournful, choking quality that sent shivers crawling across his skin. He moved slowly, holding the candle aloft. "Is someone there?" he called. Silence. Then the crying again, closer. He spun toward the altar, but saw only shadows. "Who's there?" No reply. He stepped forward, peering into the dark behind the pulpit. The candlelight trembled. Nothing. He stood still, straining to hear. Somewhere above, the bell tower creaked. The sobbing stopped. In its place, a whisper so faint it barely stirred the air. He whirled, but there was no one behind him. No breeze, no movement. Just that word, ancient and trembling, now lost to the silence. A low bang echoed from the back of the church, like a pew slamming shut. Elijah gasped and turned. The flame flickered wildly, almost snuffing out. He retreated slowly, step by step, his hand tight around the candle. The back doors stood closed, but the air felt newly cold, as though something unseen had passed through. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, his skin prickled. Back in the rectory, he locked the door and slid a chair beneath the handle. He sat in silence, watching the fire struggle to stay alive. Every so often, he thought he heard movement in the church again. A creak, a breath. Sleep was impossible. He stared into the shadows until they began to move. Outside, the wind keened like a grieving woman, and from the church, across the yard, just barely audible through the stone walls, crying. It would not be the last time he heard it. Morning came reluctantly, dragging with it a pale sun that offered no warmth. The mist had thickened overnight, turning the village of Gloamhollow into a wraith-like blur. Reverend Elijah Cross stepped out of the rectory with sleep-deprived eyes and an unshakable chill clinging to his spine. He crossed the churchyard, noting again how silent everything was. The birds did not sing, the trees did not rustle. The world seemed caught in a breathless pause. He lit the candles within the sanctuary and began morning prayers, his voice echoing weakly through the cavernous space. Yet the familiar rhythm of the liturgy brought little comfort. He couldn't forget the crying he'd heard, nor the whisper, that strange invocation, Benedicite. As he placed the chalice on the altar, he noticed faint scuff marks on the stone floor. He knelt and brushed them with his fingers. They resembled the dragging prints of bare feet, yet they led nowhere. They simply ended, as if their maker had vanished into thin air. His skin prickled with unease. Later that day, he visited the small general store in the village, hoping to learn more about the church and the previous vicar. The proprietor, Mr. Dunley, was a terse man with a lazy eye and hands that trembled ever so slightly. When Elijah mentioned Father Alaric, Dunley gave a slow shake of his head. "He was a good man," he said, voice flat, devout, kind, but he changed toward the end. Wouldn't speak to no one, would stare off for hours, said he was being watched, then he disappeared. Did he ever speak of strange occurrences in the church? Dunley hesitated, then leaned closer. He said there was a woman who cried, always crying, said it came from the old crypt below the altar. There's a crypt? Aye, sealed up long ago. No one's opened it in decades. Best left shut. Elijah returned to the church with the name burning in his thoughts. The crypt. He examined the altar floor more closely that evening, brushing aside the worn rug. Underneath, he discovered a rusted iron ring embedded in a square slab of stone. It didn't budge. That night, he lit every candle in the church. The place felt larger in the dark, full of hidden spaces and lingering shadows. He sat near the altar, listening. Midnight came, then past. The silence deepened, pressing against the walls. And then it returned. The crying. Not a distant sound this time, but close, intimate, like someone kneeling just beyond the altar rail. He stood slowly, heart pounding, candle held high. The sound was unmistakable. A woman's sobs, ragged and full of despair. He edged around the altar, and there she was. A figure kneeling on the cold stone, her back to him, clad in the dark habit of a nun, her veil draped over her shoulders. Her hands were clasped before her in prayer, though they trembled violently. A low moan escaped her lips. "Who are you?" Elijah whispered. She didn't respond. She did not move. He took a step closer. The candlelight wavered. "Can I help you?" Still nothing. Her shoulders quivered. He reached out. Just as his fingers nearly touched her shoulder, she turned her head. Her face was pale and gaunt, eyes black with sorrow, mouth twisted in a silent scream. Then she vanished, not slowly, not gently, but violently, as if ripped from reality. Elijah stumbled back, the candle dropping from his hand and extinguishing on the floor. Darkness swallowed him. He fumbled for his matches, hands shaking, and lit a fresh candle. But the space where the nun had knelt was empty. Only the faint scent of roses lingered, sweet and rotting. The next day he combed through the parish archives in a dusty back room of the rectory. There, amidst baptism records and tithing ledgers, he found a brittle pamphlet titled The Martyrs of St. Sebastian's. Toward the end was a brief mention of Sister Agnes. Condemned in 1637 for acts of sacrilege, took her own life in the crypt below the altar, buried with no rites. Her soul was said to wander, lamenting her sin. A marginal note, newer than the rest, had been added in another hand. She cries still. Don't let her out. That evening, Elijah dreamt of her. In the dream, she stood at the edge of his bed, weeping blood. Her hands were raw, nails torn, clutching a rosary made of teeth. She mouthed words he could not hear, but when he woke, those words echoed in his skull. "Absolve me." He returned to the altar before dawn, resolve hardening. He brought with him a crowbar and a lantern. It took hours of straining, but at last, the stone slab shifted, revealing a cold shaft of darkness. The smell hit him first: decay, mildew, earth, and something older, something wrong. He descended slowly into the crypt. The space below was cramped and lined with niches. Bones rested in shallow alcoves. He passed one skeleton still wearing a corroded cross, its jaw open as if caught mid-scream. The far wall bore a stone slab etched with faded Latin. He translated it slowly. "Sister Agnes of the Order of Mercy. May she find peace." But the slab was broken, cracked down the center. A jagged line ran through her name. He stepped closer and felt a sudden drop in temperature. His breath misted. The lantern flickered. Behind him, the sobbing began again. He turned. She was there, closer than before. This time she looked into his eyes, and in hers, Elijah saw torment, centuries old. She reached for him, not violently but pleadingly. Her mouth moved without sound. Then the silence shattered. A shriek, louder than thunder, filled the crypt. The lantern blew out. In the pitch darkness, Elijah heard her whisper at last,
"Help me."
When he emerged hours later, the dawn was a faint smudge on the horizon. His hair was damp with sweat, his hands filthy. The church seemed smaller somehow, as if recoiling from what had been disturbed. He collapsed in the rectory, every joint trembling. The ghost was real, and it wanted something. But what? He knew only this: the veil between the living and the dead had grown thin, and Sister Agnes, whatever her sin, was not resting. Outside, the wind stirred the churchyard trees. From within the stone walls of St. Sebastian's, the crying resumed, and Elijah, unable to help himself, began to cry with her. The bell tolled at midnight. Elijah awoke with a start, heart hammering in his chest. The rectory was silent, but from across the courtyard came the unmistakable clang of the church bell, a slow, deliberate toll that echoed through the empty village. He checked the clock. 12 precisely. Who was ringing it? He dressed quickly, wrapping his coat tightly around him. The mist outside was thicker than ever, a suffocating curtain that swallowed sound and space. As he made his way through the graveyard, the trees loomed like shadowy sentinels. Every step seemed too loud, too deliberate in the unnatural hush. When he reached the church doors, they were ajar. The air was heavy with incense and mildew, but there was something else now, something rank and foul, like the breath of a sealed tomb recently disturbed. Inside, the bell ropes hung still, unmoving, yet the sound continued above, tolling from the tower. Elijah ascended the spiral stairs, each footfall echoing like a gunshot in the confined stone space. The bell tower was empty. The great bronze bell rocked gently on its beam, no hand guiding it. It rang once more, then stopped with a suddenness that sent a shiver through Elijah's spine. Silence returned, thicker than before. And then the whispering began, not from the tower, but below, distant voices rising in chorus, unintelligible and layered, like a congregation praying in reverse. Elijah descended quickly, his lantern flickering wildly. As he reached the nave, the temperature plummeted. The whispers ceased. Then the sobbing resumed. Only now, it wasn't just one voice, it was several. women weeping, wailing. The sound echoed from the walls like a mournful chant. He turned and froze. Sister Agnes stood at the altar again, but she was not alone. 3 others stood beside her. They wore the same dark habits, their faces veiled. One reached out a hand as if to beg, but her fingers were withered, blackened, skin peeling from bone. They stared at Elijah with eyeless sockets. He stumbled backward and tripped over a pew, crashing to the ground. The nuns vanished in an instant, leaving only the stifling weight of their presence behind. Crawling to his feet, Elijah fled back to the rectory. He locked the door and slumped to the floor, breathing raggedly. His faith, once an iron bastion, was beginning to crack. Sleep did not return that night. The next morning, Elijah visited the village historian, Mrs. Wren, a woman well into her 80s who lived on the edge of town in a cottage swallowed by ivy. Her living room was a shrine to the past, shelves buckling under ancient tomes, walls lined with faded portraits. He relayed what he'd found about Sister Agnes. Mrs. Wren listened, her hands knitting without pause. The nuns were from the convent of the White Mercy, founded in the 15th century. They cared for the sick during a plague that swept through Gloamhollow. But when the deaths increased, they were blamed. Blamed? For healing people? She nodded grimly. Folk turned superstitious, said the sisters were witches, claimed they poisoned the wells, cursed the fields. When the vicar refused to act, villagers stormed the convent. Elijah sat, stomach turning. What happened? They burned the convent, locked the nuns inside. All perished, all but one, Sister Agnes. Aye, she survived, but not for long. They say she took refuge in the church, sought asylum, but the vicar betrayed her. Let the mob in. Elijah felt bile rise in his throat. And she killed herself in the crypt? Mrs. Wren met his gaze. No, Reverend. She was dragged there and buried alive. Elijah returned to the church, his steps slow, burdened with the weight of what he'd learned. The place felt changed, no longer a sanctuary, but a vessel for suffering. He stood before the altar. The cracked stone yawned below him. I'm sorry, he whispered. The air stirred. A cold breath passed over his cheek. That night, he began an exorcism. He read from the book of prayer, voice steady despite the dread in his bones. Candles flickered wildly as he spoke, shadows twisting on the walls like writhing limbs. When he reached the invocation of St. Michael, the church groaned. The temperature plummeted, the sobbing erupted into screams, the candles blew out. And then came the scratching from beneath the altar, a slow, deliberate scraping, nails on stone. Then a voice, raw and broken. Non debitor. A Latin phrase, it shall not be forgiven. The stone slab began to tremble. Dust fell from the ceiling. Elijah rushed to relight the candles, but his matches snapped one after the other. The church darkened around him. Then, with a violent crack, the stone split further. A hand pushed through the gap, bloodied, skeletal, twitching. Elijah screamed. He fled into the night, the scream of Sister Agnes chasing him across the churchyard. He collapsed in his study, clutching his Bible. The floor beneath him pulsed faintly, as though the earth itself throbbed with buried life. He opened the good book, desperate for guidance. A single page had been torn out. It lay on the floor beside him. It read, "You broke the seal." Elijah awoke to the sound of flies. They buzzed angrily at the window, their wings a low, droning tremor that grew louder the more he listened. He sat up, sticky with sweat, and noticed something new. His room stank. A wet, meaty odor like rotting flesh wafted from the floorboards. He gagged and stepped out into the hallway, only to find a trail of dark moisture leading toward the stairs. He followed it, down the narrow hallway, past the painting of St. Jude, down the creaking steps into the kitchen. The trail stopped at the cellar door. Elijah stared. He had never opened the cellar. He grabbed a lantern and unlocked the door. A gust of fetid air hit him, so strong it made his eyes water. The cellar stairs were damp, slick with something that shimmered under the flickering light. He descended. The cellar was narrow and low, lined with old shelving and cobwebs. At the far end sat a pile of broken furniture. Behind it, a bricked-up wall, the mortar newer than the surrounding stone. He stepped closer. There were claw marks on the bricks. That morning, he searched the church archives. Among brittle pages and faded ink, he found records dating back to the 1600s. Scrawled in the margins of a death register was an ominous note. "The crying will never cease. She mourns what we did, and still we hear her beneath the altar." Another entry, dated decades later. "Do not pray too loudly at midnight. That is when she listens." Elijah shut the book. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the rafters. The village felt abandoned, the streets empty, windows shuttered. Even the birds were silent. When he returned to the church that night, it was already dark. The wind had died, leaving behind a suffocating stillness. He stepped inside, every creak of the wooden door loud enough to wake the dead. He approached the altar. The stone slab had split further. A black gap yawned at its center. A stench wafted up from the crypt, rank and coppery. Something was down there, something old and angry. He descended. The crypt was small, barely more than a chamber. Piles of old bones lined the walls. The air was wet and cold. At the far end stood a single coffin, sealed in iron bands, but the lid had been pried open. Elijah stepped closer. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a woman in a tattered habit. Her hands were folded, clutching a rosary made of thorns. As he looked on, her head slowly turned, eyes opened, milky white, a mouth stretched wide, and she screamed, a shriek that pierced the marrow of his bones. He fled, up the stone steps, through the church, across the yard. The scream followed him, reverberating through the trees. He didn't stop running until he reached Mrs. Wren's. The historian let him in without question. She handed him tea, her eyes grave. "She's awake," Elijah said. Mrs. Wren nodded. "The seal was broken. There's no undoing it now." He sat trembling. "Why is she so wrathful?" "She's not just mourning," Mrs. Wren said. "She's bound to this place. Vengeance was her final breath." Elijah looked up. There were others with her. "Aye," Mrs. Wren whispered. "The sisters who died that night. They were buried here too. The crypt is their tomb." "Then why appear to me?" "Because you wear the collar of the betrayer." Back at the church, Elijah prepared for one final rite. He laid out the candles in a circle, anointed the altar with holy oil, and began to pray. Psalms filled the empty space like armor. For hours he chanted. The church responded with groans. Wood cracked, stone wept, and then silence. He stood alone, breathing hard. And from the altar, Sister Agnes rose. but she no longer looked like a woman. Her face was a hollow skull, skin stretched thin, lips torn away to reveal jagged teeth. Her habit flowed like smoke. She hovered inches above the floor, the rosary of thorns wrapped around her neck. Behind her came the others. The 4 ghostly nuns stood around Elijah, their hands outstretched. He dropped to his knees. "I am not him," he whispered. "I'm not the man who damned you." Agnes's eyes bled shadows.
All wear the glove for one.
They descended upon him. The church went dark. At dawn, the villagers found the church doors flung open. The altar was cracked wide, as though split by lightning. The floor beneath was soaked with blood, but Elijah was gone. No body, no sign of struggle. Only his Bible, resting open at Psalm 88. "Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps." The days that followed Elijah's disappearance were thick with silence. The parish, once cautiously curious about its new vicar, now grew mutinous in its hush. The villagers walked the lanes with lowered eyes, and no one, not even the boldest child, dared approach the church. On the 3rd morning, a grim procession arrived from the diocese. A senior priest named Father Grayson took temporary charge. Accompanied by 2 assistants, he moved into the vicarage and announced a formal cleansing ritual would be held. No villager volunteered to assist. Father Grayson spent his first evening in solemn prayer inside the church. By midnight, he emerged pale and shaken. The villagers watching from their curtained windows noted how he crossed himself 3 times before slamming the church doors shut. Inside the church, the temperature dropped with every passing hour. Pews warped under invisible weight. Shadows bent where no light should fall. The altar, still cracked from Elijah's final night, oozed moisture that glistened like fresh blood. The thorns of the rosary remained. Coiled like a serpent on the stone, the beads twitched when touched, retreating with a sound like whispering silk. Father Grayson began his rites the next day, dousing the nave in holy water and reciting psalms in Latin. His assistants nailed blessed crucifixes to each corner of the church. On the 2nd night, one of the assistants vanished. The other was found cowering in the bell tower, his face locked in a grimace of such fear he could no longer speak. Back at the Wren residence, old Beatrice Wren reopened her father's journals. Her father, a clergyman before her, had been the last to truly investigate the church's curse before abandoning it in the 1940s. "The veil is weakest where faith failed most," he had written. Agnes was betrayed not just by her order, but by God's own emissary. Beatrice shivered and turned the page. They sealed her cries beneath the church, and with every prayer uttered above, her pain multiplied. She is not merely a spirit, she is a wound. That night, Beatrice visited the church. She lit a candle at the altar and whispered, "Forgive them. Forgive us." The flame flickered violently. A chill wind spiraled through the rafters. She could feel her breath freezing. And then, the sound of weeping. It came from the crypt. Father Grayson barred entry to the church. Services were suspended indefinitely. Villagers began seeing shadows where none should be. A nun watching from the graveyard, a woman with torn lips and hollow eyes walking the moors at dusk. One night, a local shepherd found his flock butchered. Their eyes were missing, their bodies arranged in the shape of a cross. A trail of thorn petals led back to the church. Inside, the altar glowed faintly red. No one entered. In her final attempt to bring peace, Beatrice Wren gathered what remained of the old histories. She returned to the crypt with a new Bible, her father's crucifix, and a single candle. She descended the steps at midnight. The coffin had been sealed again, but the bricks at the rear of the chamber now bore new claw marks. Black ooze trickled between them. A low groaning sound, like wind through a tomb, echoed faintly. Beatrice knelt and began to pray. It was not long before she heard it, the weeping. And then a voice.
We promised. We would be saved.
Beatrice looked up. Sister Agnes stood before her body flickering like flame, her face a shroud of agony, her hands dripped red. "I believe you," Beatrice said, voice trembling. "Tell me what to do." The nun tilted her head.
Blood sealed it. Blood will free it.
And vanished. 3 nights later, lightning struck the church. Flames roared through the nave, consuming centuries of worship in moments. Yet, when the villagers arrived, they saw something they could not explain. The crucifix above the altar glowed with white fire, untouched by the blaze. And beneath it stood Elijah, or what remained of him. His face was pale and drawn, eyes glowing faintly blue. Around him stood the 5 nuns, veiled in smoke. He opened his mouth but did not speak. Instead, the sound of weeping filled the burning air. Then, with a scream that shattered every pane of stained glass, they vanished into the flames. Years passed. A new vicar eventually came, though few remained from the old congregation. The church had been rebuilt, bright and modern, with white stone and clean walls. The crypt was sealed permanently. The vicar, a cheerful woman named Reverend Helen Maris, knew only fragments of the story. She was told it was all folklore, bad dreams, and superstition. Her first few weeks passed peacefully. Then came the storm. Late one night, she walked into the church to check a leaking window. Thunder rolled. Rain hammered the roof. Lightning lit the stained glass in pulses. And from the altar she heard it, soft and unmistakable, the sound of a woman crying. She turned. At the far end of the nave stood a figure in a black habit, face hidden, head bowed. Beside her stood a man in a torn cassock. His eyes glowed faintly. She blinked. They were gone. The storm passed, but the church would never be quiet again. Thank you for listening to Whispers in the Dark. If you'd like to support the show, head over to our Patreon where you can sign up to one of 3 different tiers. Or if you'd prefer to make a one-off contribution, maybe you'd like to buy me a coffee or show support through our website at Buzzsprout. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and YouTube to stay up to date with new episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and more chilling tales. Music written and composed by Roman Dudchik. And remember, you've heard the whispers, but some doors, once opened, never truly close. If you feel something watching tonight, don't look back. We'll see you next time, if the dark lets you go.